Sometimes the place you never wanted to end up becomes the place where your life quietly begins. If someone had told me that losing my apartment would become the best thing that ever happened to me, I would have laughed, loaded another moving box into my car, and driven away without believing a single word. 24 hours earlier, my biggest concern had been deciding what to cook for dinner after work. Then a burst water pipe flooded half my apartment building, forcing everyone on my floor to leave until the damage could be repaired. By the end of the afternoon, everything I owned was packed into the back of my aging sedan, and I was staring at my phone, wondering how long I could pretend everything was under control. My older brother, Ryan, solved the problem before I even finished explaining it. "Just stay at my place," he said without hesitation. "I have to leave for a business trip tomorrow morning anyway. You can use the apartment until your building is ready again." It sounded simple, temporary. One small inconvenience before life returned to normal. I arrived just after 9 that evening with 2 suitcases, 1 backpack, and a level of exhaustion that made every step feel heavier than the last. The hallway outside Ryan's apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of a television coming from somewhere down the corridor. I unlocked the door with the spare key he had hidden months earlier, pushed it open, and quietly stepped inside. The lights were off except for the soft glow coming from the television in the living room. At first I thought Ryan had fallen asleep before finishing whatever game he had been watching. Then I noticed someone stretched across the couch beneath a gray blanket. I stopped moving immediately. My heartbeat seemed much louder than the television. For one confused second, I wondered if I had somehow entered the wrong apartment. The stranger shifted slightly before slowly opening his eyes. We stared at each other in complete silence. He looked just as surprised as I felt. After a long moment, he sat up, rubbed one hand across his face, and gave me an apologetic smile. "You must be Liam," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. I blinked. "You know who I am?" He nodded. "Ryan warned me that his younger brother might need a place to stay." I let out the breath I had apparently been holding. "Then you must be Mason." He stood, offering his hand with an easy smile. "Mason Hayes. Ryan and I have been best friends since college." I shook his hand, still trying to understand why Ryan had forgotten to mention that someone else was already living here. "I thought I was staying on the couch," I admitted. Mason laughed quietly before scratching the back of his neck. "That makes 2 of us. My apartment is being renovated this week, so Ryan told me I could stay here until the contractors finished." We both turned toward the same couch at exactly the same time. There was only 1 living room, 1 couch, and 1 very obvious problem. "Well," Mason said after a few awkward seconds, "I guess we are going to have to figure something out." Despite everything that had gone wrong during the past 2 days, I found myself smiling. There was something strangely calming about the way he said it, as though every difficult situation simply needed enough patience to become manageable. I set my suitcases beside the wall while Mason searched through the hallway closet for extra blankets. Neither of us realized it yet, but the apartment that was supposed to be nothing more than a temporary stop between 2 chapters of my life was quietly becoming the place where an entirely new story was about to begin. Ryan was already awake before sunrise, moving quietly through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who had packed for more business trips than he could remember. By the time I wandered into the kitchen, he had 1 suitcase by the front door, a travel mug filled with coffee, and a stack of sticky notes lined up beside the refrigerator. Mason was standing at the counter making breakfast as though he had lived there for years instead of only a few days. "Good morning," Ryan said with a grin. "I see both of you survived the first night." Mason glanced toward me before answering. "Barely. We spent 5 minutes arguing over who should sleep on the couch." Ryan laughed. "That sounds exactly like both of you." He reached into the hallway closet and pulled out a neatly folded camping air mattress. "I forgot I still had this." Problem solved. Mason looked at the mattress, then back at me with a relieved smile. "Looks like neither of us has to lose the argument." Within half an hour, Ryan was on his way to the airport after reminding us where he kept extra towels, spare keys, and emergency contact numbers. Before leaving, he pointed toward both of us. "Take care of the apartment. More importantly, take care of each other." The front door closed behind him, leaving the apartment surprisingly quiet. Mason looked around the living room before letting out a slow breath. "Well," he said, "I guess we are officially temporary roommates." I smiled. "That sounds less complicated than it feels." We spent the rest of the morning organizing the apartment so my suitcases no longer blocked the hallway. Mason cleared one side of the coat closet without me asking. I folded my clothes into empty dresser drawers Ryan had offered me years earlier but had never actually needed. Every small task somehow became easier because there were two of us doing it. Around lunchtime, Mason closed his laptop after finishing a remote meeting and looked toward me. "Have you eaten?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Come with me." 20 minutes later, we were walking through a neighborhood grocery store, filling a shopping cart with ingredients for the week. Mason moved confidently through each aisle while I followed beside him, occasionally reaching for the same item at the exact same time. Every accidental moment ended with an awkward laugh that became a little less awkward each time it happened. "Ryan always said you liked cooking," Mason said while comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce. "Only when someone else washes the dishes." He smiled. "That can be arranged." Back at the apartment, we prepared dinner together without needing much direction. He chopped vegetables while I stirred the sauce. We exchanged stories about work, favorite movies, and childhood vacations. I learned he grew up in a quiet coastal town where everyone recognized each other by name, while he discovered I still collected postcards from every place I visited, even though I rarely traveled anymore. The conversations never felt forced. They simply drifted from one subject to another with the ease of two people who happened to enjoy each other's company. After dinner, I stood at the sink washing plates when Mason quietly placed a clean dish towel beside me before I even realized I needed one. It was such a small gesture that most people would never notice it, yet somehow I did. Later that evening, while searching online for apartments, I casually mentioned that I had skipped dessert because I preferred blueberry pie over chocolate cake anyway. Mason only nodded before returning to his book. I thought nothing of the conversation until the following morning, when I opened the refrigerator and found a small slice of blueberry pie waiting on the middle shelf with a handwritten note that simply read, "Thought you might like this." I smiled without meaning to, realizing that for someone I had met less than 24 hours earlier, Mason had already begun remembering the little things that most people usually forgot. By the third morning, the apartment no longer felt like a place where two strangers happened to be sharing the same roof. Without ever talking about it, we had slipped into routines that made each day feel surprisingly comfortable. Mason always woke up first, filling the kitchen with the familiar aroma of fresh coffee before I even left the air mattress. I always opened the balcony door while breakfast cooked because the cool morning air somehow made the entire apartment feel brighter. We never planned those habits. They simply happened until neither of us questioned them anymore. I found Mason sitting on the balcony with a paperback novel resting on one knee while the first light of sunrise reflected against the nearby buildings. He looked up and smiled as I stepped outside holding my coffee mug. "You are getting better at waking up early," he said. "I think your coffee deserves most of the credit." He laughed quietly before moving his chair just enough to make room beside him. We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the city slowly come to life below us. Delivery trucks rolled through quiet streets, dog walkers greeted familiar neighbors, and somewhere nearby a radio played old songs softly enough to blend into the morning breeze. The silence between us never felt uncomfortable, felt peaceful. After several minutes, Mason closed his book. "Ryan always said you liked mornings." I smiled. "He remembers everything." "He does," Mason agreed. "I guess I learned that from him." Looking back, I realized he had already remembered far more than I expected. He knew I preferred dark roast coffee without sugar. He noticed I always reached for the blue coffee mug instead of the white one. Somehow he even remembered that I liked the window slightly open while eating breakfast because fresh air helped me wake up. None of those things seemed important by themselves, but together they quietly created a feeling I had not expected to find in someone I had only recently met. That afternoon, another email arrived from my insurance company. Repairs to my apartment building were taking longer than expected, which meant I would probably be staying another week. I stared at the message longer than necessary before setting my phone on the table. Mason looked over from his laptop almost immediately. "Bad news?" he asked. "Looks like I am not going anywhere anytime soon." Instead of offering empty sympathy, he simply nodded. "Then we have more time to improve your cooking." I pretended to sound offended. "I thought you liked my cooking." "I do," he replied with a grin. "But I also like teasing you." I laughed before I realized how much lighter the disappointment suddenly felt. Later that evening, we walked to the neighborhood grocery store together. While I compared prices on pasta, Mason quietly reached into the cart and replaced the brand I had picked with another one. "Trust me," he said. "This one tastes better." "How do you know?" Ryan and I tested almost every brand during college because neither of us could afford eating out. I shook my head, laughing. "That sounds strangely scientific." We took our pasta very seriously. On the way back, one of the paper grocery bags split open, sending apples rolling across the sidewalk. Before I could react, Mason hurried after every single one with complete determination, while I stood there laughing so hard that I almost dropped the second bag. A passing couple smiled as they watched him rescue the last apple before it reached the curb. Mason returned carrying the fruit with a victorious grin. "Nobody gets left behind," he announced proudly. I looked at him, still laughing, and realized something that surprised me more than the broken grocery bag ever could. Somewhere between shared breakfasts, quiet conversations, and ordinary errands, I had completely stopped thinking about the apartment I had lost because, without noticing when it happened, I had started looking forward to every new day inside this one. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so natural that it became difficult to remember we had only known each other for less than a week. Every morning began with the sound of the coffee maker humming softly in the kitchen. Every evening ended with dinner, quiet conversations, and the television playing in the background even though neither of us paid much attention to whatever was on the screen. Somewhere between those ordinary moments, the apartment stopped feeling borrowed. It started feeling familiar. One Thursday afternoon, I returned from visiting another apartment recommended by my insurance company. The online photos had promised bright rooms and peaceful surroundings, but the actual building overlooked a busy intersection. The walls were thin enough to hear conversations through them, and the rent was far beyond what I wanted to spend. I tossed the rental brochure onto the kitchen counter with a disappointed sigh. Mason looked up from his laptop almost immediately. "Not what you hoped for?" he asked. I shook my head. "It looked much better on the internet." He closed his computer without another question and stood. "Get your jacket." I looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Why?" "Because you have spent the entire week worrying about apartments." He picked up his car keys with an easy smile. "I think you deserve one afternoon where we pretend none of that exists." 20 minutes later, we were walking through the city's botanical garden, where weekday admission happened to be free. The winding paths led us past colorful flower beds, quiet ponds, and shaded benches filled with people enjoying the cool autumn weather. We talked about everything except housing. Mason told me stories about growing up in a small coastal town where everyone waved at each other from their front porches. I admitted that when I was younger, I wanted to become a travel photographer before deciding that a more stable career sounded like the responsible choice. "Do you still think about it?" Mason asked as we crossed a small wooden bridge overlooking a pond filled with water lilies. I smiled. "Sometimes." He nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams have a funny way of waiting until we are ready to notice them again." Before leaving the garden, a volunteer handed every visitor a small envelope containing wildflower seeds. I laughed quietly while turning the packet over in my hands. "I do not even know where I would plant these." Mason glanced at the envelope before slipping it into the pocket of his jacket. "Then I will keep them safe until you have the right place." The words were simple, yet something about them stayed with me during the entire drive home. That evening, Ryan called from his hotel to check on us. After asking about work and the apartment repairs, he laughed and said, "I was worried leaving the two of you together would be awkward." Mason looked across the living room toward me before answering with an easy smile. "Honestly, it has been one of the easiest weeks I have had in a long time." I felt myself smiling without realizing it. After the call ended, Mason returned to preparing dinner while quietly humming a song I did not recognize. I watched him move comfortably around the kitchen, opening cabinets without thinking, reaching for ingredients with practiced confidence, and somehow making the apartment feel warmer simply by being there. That was the moment I realized the invisible line between friendship and something more had quietly begun to appear. I also realized I had no intention of crossing it because Mason was Ryan's best friend, and I convinced myself that whatever I was beginning to feel would be far easier to ignore than to risk changing everything we had built during one unforgettable week. Friday arrived with the same quiet routine that had slowly become the best part of my day. Mason had already brewed coffee before I woke up, and the familiar smell drifted through the apartment while soft morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. We exchanged the same easy greetings we had every morning that week, yet I noticed myself studying every little expression on his face for reasons I could no longer explain. The more comfortable life became inside Ryan's apartment, the more I reminded myself that it was only temporary. Sooner or later I would return to my own place, Mason would go back to his apartment, and this unexpected chapter would quietly become nothing more than a pleasant memory. That afternoon Mason told me he needed to step out for an hour. "I have to meet someone," he said while reaching for his jacket. "I will be back before dinner." I nodded without giving it much thought. "Do not worry, I will start cooking." He smiled. "Please do not burn the kitchen down while I am gone." I laughed as he walked out the door. After spending another hour searching apartment listings without much success, I decided to grab fresh bread from the bakery around the corner before Mason returned. The sidewalks were busy with people finishing work for the week, and the cool breeze carried the smell of coffee and fresh pastries through the neighborhood. As I approached the small parking lot beside the bakery, I noticed a familiar figure standing near a dark blue sedan. Mason was talking to a young woman with long brown hair. Before I could wave, she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around him in a warm embrace. Mason smiled in a way I had never seen before, gentle and completely at ease, before returning the hug naturally. I stopped walking without realizing it. The bakery, the traffic, and the conversations around me suddenly faded into the background. My first thought was painfully simple. Of course someone like Mason would already have someone special in his life. He was thoughtful, kind, patient, and somehow remembered every small detail about the people around him. Why would he ever be alone? I quietly turned around before either of them noticed me and walked back toward the apartment carrying nothing except the heavy feeling that had suddenly settled inside my chest. By the time Mason returned home later that evening holding a paper bag filled with groceries, I had already convinced myself to act as though nothing had happened. "Good timing," he said cheerfully. "I found fresh tomatoes for the pasta." "That is great," I answered, forcing a smile that even I knew looked unconvincing. Mason paused for a brief moment, studying my face with quiet concern. "Everything okay?" "Just tired." He did not question the answer, but I noticed him watching me several times during dinner as though trying to solve a puzzle he could not quite understand. The easy conversations that had filled the apartment all week were replaced by long stretches of silence. I hated myself for creating the distance, yet I could not stop imagining the woman from the parking lot. Later that night, after we had cleaned the kitchen together, Mason quietly placed a steaming mug of chamomile tea beside me on the coffee table. "You always seem to sleep better after this," he said with a small smile before wishing me good night. I stared at the cup long after he disappeared into the hallway. Even now, after believing I had seen the truth with my own eyes, he was still taking care of me in the same thoughtful ways he always had. Somehow that only made letting go hurt even more. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual, hoping that a good night's sleep would somehow untangle the thoughts that had followed me since the afternoon at the bakery. Instead, the apartment felt unusually quiet. Mason was already sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, but he was not working. A fresh cup of dark roast coffee rested beside my favorite blue mug, exactly where he always left it. He looked up as I entered the kitchen and smiled with the same warmth he had shown since the day we met. "Good morning," he said. "I made coffee before it got cold." "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound normal. He studied me for a brief moment before returning to his screen. Appreciated that he never pushed when I seemed distracted. Yet somehow that patience made the silence between us feel even heavier. Around noon, Ryan called from the airport while waiting for his connecting flight home. Mason answered using the speakerphone because both of us were in the kitchen preparing lunch. "How are my favorite temporary roommates?" Ryan asked cheerfully. "Still getting along?" Mason laughed. "Better than you probably expected." Ryan chuckled. "I knew you would. By the way, Mason, did Emily finally make it back safely after surprising you yesterday?" My hands stopped moving almost instantly. Mason nodded even though Ryan could not see him. "She did. She texted me after she got home. She was happy we finally had time to catch up." Ryan laughed again. "I still cannot believe your little sister flew across the country without telling anyone she was coming." Mason smiled. "That is Emily. She likes surprising people." The conversation continued naturally, but I barely heard another word. My thoughts were already racing backward to the parking lot outside the bakery. The woman I had convinced myself was someone Mason loved had been his younger sister all along. The hug I had spent an entire evening replaying inside my head had been nothing more than a joyful family reunion after months apart. When the call ended, Mason carried the salad bowls to the table while I remained standing beside the kitchen counter, feeling equal parts relieved and embarrassed. Every short answer I had given him the night before, every forced smile, every awkward silence suddenly seemed unfair. I had created distance between us because of a story I invented without ever asking a single question. Mason noticed my expression almost immediately. "You look like you just remembered something important," he said. I laughed quietly, rubbing the back of my neck. "More like realizing something I should have understood yesterday." He tilted his head with gentle curiosity. "Want to talk about it?" I considered telling him everything, but the words refused to come. Instead, I smiled honestly for the first time since the misunderstanding began. "Maybe not yet." He accepted the answer, with a small nod, never asking for more than I was ready to give. That afternoon, while organizing the living room, I noticed the small envelope of wildflower seeds still resting safely on the bookshelf exactly where Mason had placed it after our visit to the botanical garden. I picked it up, turning it over thoughtfully in my hands. Mason looked over from the couch and smiled. "I told you I would keep them safe until you found the right place." I met his eyes and smiled back, realizing that perhaps the most important thing he had been protecting all week was never the seeds at all. It was the quiet hope that something unexpected could continue growing if both of us were willing to give it a little more time. Ryan returned home that evening just as the sun was disappearing behind the buildings across the street, carrying his suitcase in one hand and a paper bag full of takeout containers in the other. The apartment immediately filled with his familiar energy, as though everything had returned to the way it was supposed to be. He greeted me with a quick hug, bumped shoulders with Mason, and laughed when he noticed the wildflower seeds still sitting on the bookshelf. "You actually remembered those," he said. Mason smiled. "Someone had to." We spent dinner listening to Ryan tell stories about delayed flights, endless meetings, and a hotel coffee machine that somehow managed to burn every cup it brewed. The conversation flowed easily, but every so often I caught Mason looking in my direction before quietly looking away again. I found myself doing exactly the same thing. It felt as though both of us knew something had changed after yesterday's misunderstanding, yet neither of us knew how to put it into words. After we finished eating, Ryan checked the voicemail on his phone and suddenly looked up at me with a smile. "Looks like your building manager finally called back." My heart skipped. "Really?" He nodded. "The repairs are ahead of schedule. They finished the inspections this afternoon." I waited for the rest of the sentence even though I already knew what it would be. "You can move back home on Monday." The apartment became strangely quiet. Ryan continued, talking about paperwork, insurance forms, and collecting the replacement keys from the property office, but his voice gradually faded into the background. "Monday. Only 2 more days. Just 2 mornings left to wake up to the smell of Mason's coffee. 2 more dinners together. 2 more evenings sharing the living room that had somehow stopped feeling temporary." I smiled because I knew Ryan expected me to be happy, but something inside me felt unexpectedly heavy. Later that night, after Ryan went to bed early to recover from traveling, Mason and I remained in the living room cleaning the last few dishes. Neither of us spoke very much. The comfortable silence that had once felt peaceful now carried a quiet sadness neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. As I dried the final plate, Mason finally broke the silence. "So," he said softly, "looks like you get your apartment back." I nodded. "Yeah." He leaned against the kitchen counter, folding the dish towel more carefully than necessary. "That is good news." "It is." Neither of us sounded convinced. After another long pause, he smiled gently. "I guess this place will feel quieter again." I looked around the apartment, noticing the air mattress neatly folded in the corner, the blue coffee mug beside the sink, and the envelope of flower seeds still resting safely on the bookshelf. Every small detail suddenly felt like part of a memory that was already beginning to slip away. "I think I got used to being here," I admitted. Mason lowered his eyes before answering almost in a whisper. "So did I." The words lingered between us long after the conversation ended. The following morning I opened my suitcase and began folding the clothes that had slowly migrated from my luggage into Ryan's dresser throughout the week. Every folded shirt felt like another quiet goodbye. When I reached for the small envelope of wildflower seeds, I hesitated before placing it carefully inside the front pocket of my backpack. Mason appeared in the hallway just then, stopping when he noticed the half-packed suitcase beside me. He looked at it for several silent seconds before meeting my eyes. There was no surprise on his face because we had both known this moment was coming. Even so, neither of us looked ready to watch the other walk away. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and the quiet kind of sunlight that always seemed to make goodbyes feel more permanent. Ryan had already left for work after reminding me twice that he would help move the last few boxes that evening if I still needed him. The apartment was unusually calm, leaving only Mason and me surrounded by 2 suitcases, 1 backpack, and a week of memories that somehow felt much older than they really were. I checked my phone one last time before locking the screen. The building manager had confirmed everything was ready. My apartment was waiting for me. It was exactly the news I had hoped for only days earlier. Yet standing in Ryan's living room, I could not convince myself to feel excited. Mason quietly helped carry my bags toward the front door without saying much. Every movement seemed careful, almost as though he were trying to delay the moment neither of us wanted to reach. When the last suitcase rested beside the entrance, he stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the floor for several long seconds before finally raising his eyes to meet mine. "Is everything packed?" he asked softly. I nodded. "I think so." He glanced around the apartment one last time before walking toward the bookshelf. Reaching carefully behind a stack of novels, he pulled out the small envelope of wildflower seeds and placed it gently into my hand. "I almost forgot," he said with a quiet smile. "These belong to you." I looked down at the envelope, remembering the afternoon in the botanical garden when he promised to keep them safe until I found the right place. Somehow the paper felt heavier now than it had that day. I slipped it into my backpack, took a slow breath, and reached for the handle of my suitcase. Before I could turn the doorknob, I heard Mason quietly say my name. "Liam." I stopped immediately. There was something different in his voice, something I had never heard before. When I turned around, he was no longer smiling. He looked nervous in a way that seemed completely unfamiliar for someone who had always appeared so calm. He took one slow step closer before speaking again. "Can you wait another minute?" I nodded without saying a word. Mason let out a long breath as though he had been rehearsing the next sentence for days. When Ryan first offered me his couch, I almost told him no. I frowned slightly. "Why?" He laughed quietly at himself. "Because sleeping in someone else's apartment for a week sounded inconvenient." His smile faded into something much more honest. "Then you walked through the front door carrying those suitcases, and suddenly I started hoping the week would last a little longer." My heartbeat became impossible to ignore. Mason continued speaking before I had the chance to interrupt. "I kept telling myself you were only here temporarily, so none of this mattered. I thought if I ignored how much I looked forward to breakfast together, grocery shopping, watching television after dinner, or hearing you laugh over something completely ordinary. Eventually those feelings would disappear. He shook his head gently. Instead, they only became stronger. The apartment fell completely silent. I realized I had been holding my breath. Mason looked directly into my eyes with a quiet sincerity that left no room for misunderstanding. The hardest part about today is not watching you move back into your apartment. It is knowing this place will stop feeling like home the moment you walk out that door. I felt my eyes growing warm as every small memory from the past week came rushing back at once. I smiled through the emotion building in my voice and slowly let go of the suitcase handle. Maybe, I said softly, taking one step closer to him. Home was never the apartment I lost. Mason searched my face for a brief moment before hope slowly replaced the uncertainty in his expression. I reached for his hand without another word, and this time neither of us made any attempt to leave. 1 year later, I unlocked the apartment door with a set of keys that no longer felt borrowed. Morning sunlight spilled across the living room exactly as it had on the day I first arrived carrying 2 suitcases and far too many worries. The difference now was that the apartment no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to the quiet life Mason and I had chosen together, built one ordinary day at a time. The old couch still sat beneath the window, its fabric a little more worn after countless movie nights, lazy Sunday afternoons, and conversations that stretched long past midnight. Ryan liked to joke that it was the most important piece of furniture he had ever owned because it accidentally introduced 2 stubborn people who never would have admitted their feelings otherwise. Every time he visited, he pointed at the couch and laughed. I leave for one business trip, and somehow you 2 turn my living room into a love story. Mason always smiled before answering with the same familiar reply. It was your idea to let us stay here. Ryan would shake his head dramatically. I expected you to share an apartment for a week. I did not expect you to build a future. None of us ever argued with that. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt wonderfully ordinary. Mason still woke before sunrise to make fresh coffee, and I still wandered into the kitchen a few minutes later, pretending I had not followed the smell every single morning. We still spent Saturday afternoons grocery shopping together, somehow returning home with more desserts than either of us planned to buy. The small routines that had begun as temporary conveniences quietly became traditions neither of us wanted to lose. One quiet weekend, while cleaning the balcony, I noticed bright patches of color blooming inside the wooden planter Mason had built during the spring. The wildflowers from the botanical garden had grown taller than either of us expected, dancing gently whenever the afternoon breeze drifted through the apartment. I smiled as I remembered the day he promised to keep those seeds safe until I found the right place to plant them. Looking back, I realized they had never simply been flowers. They had been a promise that good things could grow when someone believed enough to wait. Mason stepped onto the balcony carrying 2 mugs of coffee and noticed me looking at the flowers. They finally bloomed, he said softly. Just like you said they would, I answered. He handed me my favorite blue mug before resting beside me against the railing. For several peaceful minutes, neither of us spoke. The city below moved through another ordinary morning, while sunlight warmed the balcony and birds sang somewhere beyond the neighboring rooftops. It was the same kind of quiet that had first brought us together, only now there were no unanswered questions hiding inside it. Ryan stopped by later that afternoon and laughed the moment he saw the flowers. You actually planted them, he said. Of course we did, Mason replied. Ryan looked from the balcony to the old couch inside the living room and smiled knowingly. Funny how the smallest things end up lasting the longest. After he left, I stood in the center of the apartment and slowly looked around. The couch where 2 strangers had first exchanged awkward introductions remained exactly where it had always been. The coffee mugs waited on the kitchen counter. The flowers swayed gently outside the open balcony door. Losing my apartment had once felt like the worst interruption my life could have offered. Now I understood it had quietly been the beginning of everything that truly mattered. Home had never been the address printed on a lease or the walls surrounding a room. Home had been waiting inside the ordinary moments I almost overlooked, beside the person who turned a temporary place to stay into the one place I would always want to return to.